All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the live stream for tonight. And this is a very special live stream. This is the debut stream on the new Real Crusades History live channel. So we're very glad to be back together, the original Real Crusades History crew. We are still waiting on Scott. He has not showed up yet, but my name is J. Stephen Roberts. I'm here with my good friends, Rand Brown. Rand, how are you doing?
Great to be here as always. I'm glad that we've come back to our live stream format. Deus Volt to all our followers and all the folks tuning in right now. And yeah, we're glad to be back.
All right, and also want to say hi to my very good friend Peter Safarian. Peter, how are you doing, sir?
Doing great. Really excited to be beginning this new chapter of RCH, and good to be back on the live stream trail. So good to see you guys again.
All right. Okay, so I already see some people in the chat. We've got Michael Perez. We've got Brian Boru. We've got World War II Templar. So this is the new channel. So this is going to be a bit more of a comfy stream, I guess you might say. A lot of people have followed us over to the new channel. But yeah, I think what we're going to do tonight is just general discussion of the Crusades, taking questions from the chat. So anything you guys in the chat want to talk about, let us know. So first of all, let's start off. Let me jump over to the chat here and just see where we are. Okay. Yeah. So once you guys start asking questions in the chat, we will definitely be addressing those. So feel free to start firing your questions out, and we will get to them. I guess we could start off just by talking a little bit about what everybody's been reading lately. Let's start with Peter. What have you been reading lately, Peter?
As far as Crusades goes, I've still been trudging along in the Oxford Illustrated Guide to the Crusades, which it's a great compendium of essays covering most aspects of the Crusades, including going from things like the military orders to Crusader states and the Holy Land, things like this. And yeah, no, it's a great book. If you want a little bit more of an in-depth look at certain areas of the Crusades, it is kind of on the heavier academic side of writing, but it's definitely worth it if you want to get information about the Crusades from some of the world's greatest Crusade scholars.
Awesome. And how about you, Rand? What have you been reading as of late?
Actually, for the past several months, I've kind of strayed away from the Crusades for a little bit because I was actually in the midst of writing a couple of journal article series for Medievalist.net and Medieval Warfare Magazine with our dear friend Dr. Andrew Latham. And those were mostly focused on kind of the 100 Years' War period. Our most recent journal article series that we did was on kind of the historicity of the history behind the myth of Robin Hood, and who was the real Robin Hood? Was there a real Robin Hood kind of thing? So a lot of what I was reading and researching for the last several months was that. However, very just recently, I actually finally broke down. I've had it. It's one of the books that's been in my Amazon queue for almost the better part of a year now, and I finally broke down and ordered it and started reading it recently. But it was a book that was recommended by our very dear friend Dr. Schrader, Helena Schrader, and it's The Crusader Armies by Steve Tibble. And it's really interesting because it goes into some, basically the premise challenges a lot of the preconceived notions that people have about the types of armies that operated in Frankish Outremer during the period of the Crusader states, what they were comprised of, who they were comprised of, the various ethnic contributions of the native Christian populations, which he Steve Tibble actually does a really good job showing how even during the period of the Crusades, even though they had been under the rule of various Islamic powers for almost, for several centuries before the Crusades came along, that by the 10th and 11th centuries, they were still predominantly Christian. They were still a predominantly Christian majority in the Holy Land at the time. And
are you talking about like in just the Kingdom of Jerusalem or other Crusader states? You're saying
in the wider Levant of the time, that they still were ethnically made up of a majority of Christian groups, of local Christian groups, whether they were Armenians or Syrians or even Palestinian Christians. So it was really interesting to kind of see him trace that out and show how one of the reasons that the Frankish Crusader kingdoms lasted as long as they did was because they had this ground where they had this grassroots support of the local native Christian communities that actually did contribute quite a bit to their survival. He pulls out several sources where various knights are named, and the names that these knights have are traditional Armenian names, and so it shows that there were various, whether they were Marianites, whether they were Greek Orthodox or Syrian Orthodox or Armenians. There were a lot of there was a lot of grassroots Christian support for the Frankish Crusade, for the actual Latin Frankish Crusaders who came in. So it's a really fascinating book. Maybe his prose is not the best. I feel like there's other writers who wrote on similar topics who were a lot more eloquent than he was. I mean, right off the top of my head, the giants like Jonathan Riley Smith and people like that come to mind. But so he's definitely not a Riley Smith, but it is interesting that he reveals that and kind of shatters the misconception that the Frankish Latin Crusaders showed up in this very hostile, very alienated environment where they were this teeny tiny little oppressive minority that just oppressed all the non-Christian peoples and whatnot. He really shatters all of that and brings it out that no, they actually very heavily relied on and even intermarried into the native local Christian communities that were still technically numerically the majority of the people who dwelt there.
So the local Christians would have made up the majority of the army for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Like, are we talking about just infantry?
That's kind of the argument he makes. Yeah, that's kind of the argument he makes. And even I knew this from a lot of my military historical studies with just the medieval period in general. The way in which chroniclers wrote about military affairs, they always were very heavily focused on the small knightly, the small cadre of knightly elite that it was formed the kind of the core of armies. the thing that you have to realize is they were by far an extreme minority in armies, and that there was this whole support network of infantry and siege specialists and engineers and just levied troops of the common folk who typically didn't get any, they really didn't get any attention from the chroniclers, but they were the majority of the armies. Those peoples in the Crusader kingdoms, or in the Crusader principalities, most likely would have been majority native local Christians. Whether they be Maronites or Syrians or Palestinian Greek Orthodox or Chaldeans or whoever. The vast majority of them would have been that, because there was a surprising degree of unlike what a lot of earlier modern scholars tried to make it out, that the Latin Christians were super intolerant to other Christian sects and things like that. They actually weren't. And he brings out the laws of the Kingdom of Jerusalem as established by the Council of Nablus in I think it was the mid 1100s when they promulgated that. They were unbelievably, especially for their day and age, they were unbelievably open and tolerant of the other Christian sects at that time, mostly just out of survival, because they knew that they were such an extreme minority there that they had to foster close ties with the local native Christian communities, and even kings of Jerusalem married into local native Christian families, most famously Baldwin II, who married an Armenian. I
believe Sibylla was an Armenian too.
Yeah,
she had Armenian ancestry, but she
had Armenian. I think her name started with an M.
Morphia.
Morphia, yeah. Baldwin II married Morphia, who was an Armenian princess. So there was this very, very close relationship that the Franks fostered with the native local Christians, and Steve Tibble does a really, really good job showing just how deep those ties were. And how intertwined those ties were. Often, sometimes even to the scandal of Western Latin visitors who came, like William of Tyre, who sometimes kind of passive aggressively scolded the Poulain, which is what the Frankish. What they considered the native Frankish dwellers of the Levant were known as, but he kind of scolds them for their loose attitudes and their ease with being around other what they considered alien cultures and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, it really did come down to it did come down to survival. And they knew that they had to get along with these people. They had to foster those deep ties, because they were the ones who had always been there. They were the ones who knew the land. They knew the peoples. They knew the culture. They knew the terrain.
And Rand, does the book also go into? Because I remember one of my early questions when I first started getting into the Crusades was what the makeup of the units was when it came to the more secular armies that, and by secular I just mean not connected to the military orders. Those were just associated with the kingdoms. Like, does he talk about different unit types and like from infantry to cavalry and names of those?
Yeah, he does reference the whole argument that Turcopole was not an ethnic distinction, that it was a like military fighting style distinction, that once you had these, Frankish native Christian for lack of a better term, half breeds, populating the kingdom, that they not only in keeping with their mixed heritage that they were adopting native styles of fighting as well. However, he does also recognize that, you know, the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its core still very much fought. They still very much utilized the Western style heavily armored knight as like the, you know, the core of the army, and they were the, for lack of a better terms, they were the shock element of the armies. But they were supported by this vast, you know, by these vastly greater numbers of troops who either were ethnically tied to the kind of the style of warfare that was more common in the East, or had simply adopted that style of fighting, you know, whether they were ethnically connected to it or not, just out of military necessity. So he does get into that a little bit. He also gets into some interesting commentary that, or some interesting evidence, or he presents some interesting evidence that that many of the native local Christians also began adopting Western styles of fighting. That, you know, that many of these knights that are recorded as, you know, that are talked about as knights in the Western sense, they all have, you know, they all have Armenian names. You know, so it's not beyond the pale of imagination to think that, you know, higher placed native Christian families would want their sons who are in the service of the kings of Jerusalem, or the, you know, princes of Antioch or wherever, to adopt the elite style of fighting that those people brought with them as a consequence of the Crusades. He's also got some really fascinating evidence. I can't remember which chronicle he pulls it from, but there are even some knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem who actually even have Arabic names. You know, so these are potentially either mixed race or even ethnically Arabic Christians who adopt the Western Latin style of you know, chivalric knighthood in service of the kings of Jerusalem. So it really was fascinating, because it even challenged a lot of ways in which I've always thought, you know, of you know, the army composition of the Crusader states and things like that. And I mean, I always figured, yeah, there were probably like auxiliary units, you know, who were made up of you know, native Christians and things like that. But you know, the idea of there being non-Frankish knights in the Western style is kind of fascinating. But at the same time, it also makes sense. Again, you know, we're talking about military necessity and just the fact that they were so outnumbered, you know, and surrounded by hostile neighbors on all sides, that it makes sense that they would have been a lot more liberal and opening of, and I mean liberal in the you know, just the actual definitive sense, not a political sense or anything like that. But you know, they would have been a lot more open and welcoming of, hey, you want to fight like us? Great, good for you. Like, here's a sword, here's a horse, here's armor. We'll give you your knightly vows. Yeah. You know?
Funny, when I was in Holy Land, our guide was a Palestinian Christian, and he actually said to me, he goes, "My ancestors fought with the Crusaders."
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you talk to most Maronite Lebanese, and there are very strong ties culturally with that community and the Crusader states, and mostly because the Maronite Rite became united with Latin Catholicism in the mid 1100s as a consequence of the Crusades and the Crusader states. So like, and that's a right that exists to this day. So these are very, very deep cultural ties, and that many of the Christian communities that are still in that part of the world still remember, and it's something a lot of people don't realize outside of that environment.
So let's get into some of the questions now. We're getting quite a few good questions coming in.
Would you like me to read some of them, Steve?
Sure. Do you want to read the one I've got on the stream?
Sure.
On the screen there, Peter?
Yes, sure. Okay, so this question comes from DeGrave. Would you consider the Visigoths the ones who really started the first technical crusade? Did they not ask the Franks for help against the non-Christian Muslim?
So, as far as I know, the Visigoths were not asking the Franks for help against the Muslims. Now, maybe if you're talking about later on, like the Kingdom of Asturias, there was some interaction there. I actually would have to go back and look to what extent there was interaction. Of course, Catalonia was basically founded by the Franks, but yeah, I don't think we could really say the Visigoths started the first technical crusade, just because a crusade is defined as a holy war proclaimed by the Pope with indulgences attached to it.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Stephen. When we use terms like crusade, we're meaning something very, very specific, which is a military pilgrimage with a specific objective that is endorsed by the magisterium of the Latin Catholic Church, which carries along with it in return for participation, carries along things, carries the spiritual benefits and the spiritual rewards of salvation and martyrdom should you die in it. None of that was present with Visigothic Spain. That in fact that entire concept really hadn't come about yet at that point in time in Western Christendom.
All right. This next question is from World War II Templar. RCH, did you ever see the documentary about the Crusades on the TV channel EWTN? It was good. EWTN, the Catholic Network, I believe, is what you're referring to.
I did see that, and it was very good.
Was that the one with that Thomas Madden was a part of?
Yes, he was interviewed, and some other historians were interviewed. I think actually Dr. Crawford may have been in that. Now that it's been a long time since I've seen it, but yeah, it was a good little documentary. They did a good job.
Yeah, I'd like to get my hands on that. I haven't seen it yet.
Let's see here. Here's a comment from Adam. I'm Mary Knight. He says, Laudatus Jesu Christus. Thank you for that, Adam.
Was the massacre of the Latins of 1182 in any way connected to the sack of Constantinople of the Fourth Crusade?
I mean, it was definitely within living memory of it. If I remember correctly, I think as a younger man, I'm not sure if he was there for the massacre of the Latins in 1182, but I do know that Enrico Dandolo of Venice, as a younger man, before he became Doge of Venice, did have some sort of very unfortunate history with the Byzantines in Constantinople. I think he lost one of his eyes, or it was something like he was maimed in some way, like physically, in an altercation of some kind with Byzantine Christians in Constantinople, and I think it's not hard to it's not hard to imagine that he might have had some personal issues or maybe a personal vendetta against against the Byzantines in the context of the Fourth Crusade, or which we really shouldn't even call a crusade because it wasn't one. Like by definition, it was not one. I mean, they were excommunicated when they took what was it?
Zara.
Zara. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, everything that happened post Zara was not a crusade, literally by definition. But I mean, it's possible. I mean, I doubt most of the guys that fought in the Latin army that took Constantinople in 1204 were, for lack of a better term, basically professional mercenaries and sellswords. So I mean, maybe some of them had, relatives or had some sort of knowledge, general knowledge of the massacre of the Latins in 1182. But, I think for the most part, they were just, they were a bunch of professional killers who wanted to get paid and were really sick and tired of all the political prevaricating and back and forth with a bunch of people who were making promises that, or to put it more bluntly, whose mouths were writing checks their asses couldn't cash, and decided to take matters into their own hands. So,
Tom Griffin asks, were the Tafors a real faction in the First Crusader army, or is this pure myth?
I've honestly only ever read about the Tafors in historical novels set during the First Crusade. At least that's what my memory is saying to me at the moment. Maybe I have read about them in some actual histories of the First Crusade. I can't remember. They've definitely never played a major role in anything I've seen. Have you guys heard of this? The Tafors were like a sort of a crazy, wild band of very, very poor soldiers in the First Crusader army who...
Yeah.
Have you heard about them, Rand?
Yeah, I have, and even it's weird. Even in the few chronicles, I think it's, I want to say it's Raymond of Aguilar's who really mentions them, like by name. I think he's the one. I could be wrong about that, but the way I've always heard it presented by the more serious academics and the more serious scholars are that the Tafors were kind of this. People have to understand that medieval chroniclers and just the medieval culture in general was they bore some similarities to like what you find in developing cultures today, where they were more telling a compelling story was valued higher than being objectively factual, which is one of the things that you really have to understand in terms of historiography when you read medieval chronicles from the times. You have to understand that what they really wanted to do, what meant way more to them was telling a compelling story, not being scientifically, objectively factual, kind of like how we've become obsessed with being in the modern era. And so you get these, for lack of a better term, artistic embellishments. That's why like numbers are usually so unreliable in the chronicles, because they're not lying, and they don't see it as lying. They don't see it as being like deceptive. It's just they're trying to make it dramatic. They're trying to make it stand out to their audience. They're trying to make it compelling. I think the Tafors, as I've read them described, are sort of another phenomena of that, where the reality was probably far more mundane and far less dramatic and far less in modern terms, disturbing than what is made out to be and what is presented to be. Was there possibly an element in the First Crusade that was maybe somewhat fanatic? Probably. Just like there isn't anything. Just like there isn't any mass movement, mass popular movement with a lot of people in it. There's always going to be some people who, maybe take things a little too far and kind of go nuts with it, but somehow that kind of got latched onto. And the other thing I've heard is that, and this kind of goes back to the whole conversation about Marat al-Numan as a whole, it's always the one that's brought up, when everybody's like, oh, the Crusaders committed cannibalism. It's like, okay, hold on, stop. Maybe there was some extremely isolated, extremely rare occurrences of that, just like there has been in any desperate situation. I mean, there was cannibalism that took place multiple times in the 20th century, in various conflicts, just out of desperation. I think, you read about like the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. You read about, the Sino-Japanese War in China during the Second World War, even during the Korean War, and even as recently as the war in Iraq. There've been tales of people who were so desperate they actually resorted to eating human flesh. But when you really dig down into it, you find out that those instances, if they even happened, were so incredibly rare and so incredibly isolated that it was not anywhere near what the stories that were told afterwards made it out to be. And that's when I read things like about the siege of Marat al-Numan or the Tafurs, that's what I always think about. I always think about, okay, this is probably an extremely isolated event that got seized upon by various people and for whatever motives got massively blown out of proportion in order to just tell a shocking story, because like today, back then, sensationalism sold. And people would probably eat those stories up, because it was shocking and sensationalist, and for whatever reason. So I highly doubt that the narrative that people believe, that is popularly believed today, was the reality. It was probably a much more isolated event and much more smaller scale and mundane than has been presented.
All right, so we have a question from somebody named It's 702X. Question that I think we've received about 1 million times over, but here it goes. Did the Crusaders really kill many Muslims and Jews when they entered Jerusalem?
Did you want a chance to hit on a question, Peter?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say a little bit about this. I mean, this is definitely something that's embellished a lot. I think a lot of people base it off of the source that talks about how the Crusaders were walking up to like rivers of blood at the time. People took that extremely literally, especially in the modern era, and that but at the time that was just meant to be metaphorical to show just how brutal the fighting was. But really, when you look at the siege of Jerusalem in context, it's just like any other medieval siege that happened. After a prolonged siege in the medieval period, usually the attacking army was angry and fed up enough with the resistance that they would just go in and start massacring, But was it absolutely indiscriminate? No. I mean, there were definitely times when the Crusaders were sparing the Muslims from harm. Raymond of Toulouse actually, helped protect, I think it was a group of Jews in their synagogue from being burned down by some of the Crusaders who went a little bit too too far in that. But
Raymond, actually, I believe Raymond protected the garrison commander and his entourage. And the garrison commander, the Fatima, his name was Iftikhar.
right.
They went to the Tower of David, and Raymond took control of that, and he protected them. But also, I think we should just kind of like you're saying, Peter. We shouldn't go overboard in thinking that that it was the Rivers of Blood thing was obviously like apocalyptic Old Testament type language, which there's a lot of that in the First Crusade Chronicles. But yeah, also there is evidence that there were Muslims who survived the siege, because after it was over, the chroniclers tell us that the Crusaders pressed the Muslims into clearing the city of corpses and debris and stuff. So obviously not everybody was killed. And also I think we should kind of point out too, it was a horrific sack. All medieval sacks were horrific. Plenty of people were killed. There was definitely, people running through the streets, killing people. I think there's no doubt that happened. Does that mean everybody was doing that? No. It's and I also think we should keep in mind too, the Muslim sources are so laconic and understated. Like the oldest Muslim source is Ibn al-Qalanisi from the Damascus Chronicle, and he just kind of like barely even talks about it. He says, yeah, they went in there and I think he mentions they burned down a synagogue or something, but he talks about it in much the same way that he talks about other sieges conducted by both Muslim and Christian armies at the time. So I think the key here is there's not really any evidence that the Muslim world was exceptionally outraged or anything like, this is a claim you hear sometimes nowadays that, this was this big scandal. Well, I think it looked a lot like a typical siege to the outside world. And yeah, I mean, I just think we should be tempered in how we look at it. And it's important to really assess the evidence intelligently and putting it in the context of medieval warfare in general. But yeah, that's what I'll say about what happened.
I think your critical point there that you mentioned, Stephen, is just that according to the peoples who belong to the cultures and religions that supposedly bore the brunt of this horrific apocalyptic massacre, quote unquote, like it barely registered as a footnote amongst them. Like they really weren't that upset about it. In fact, Ibn al-Khalisi and a couple of the others, they almost seem more focused on their fights with their fellow co-religionists. Like that seems to take up the vast majority of their conversation.
Something that's often forgot about today.
Yeah, then there was kind of and then their attitude is kind of like, oh yeah, and then these like crazy Franks showed up and like took Jerusalem like this one time, and that was weird. And then they move on, like yeah, okay, and then all of a sudden we were having to deal with these Frankish people who showed up. So I think that's a major point, that people who maybe have more political or ideological reasons for wanting to find fault with the Crusades don't comprehend or choose to not be aware of is even the people who were supposedly the victims of this horrific massacre, if it really was that, which it probably was. I think all medieval warfare would be considered horrific by modern standards, because it was just it was a much more intimate style of fighting. And I mean, the vast majority of the killing was done face to face, even between combatants. That's something that is extremely rare today, even in the most intense warfare. I mean, if you actually see the people you kill in combat today, that's considered extremely rare. Most of the time you're firing things off into over the horizon that the vast majority of the people you're killing, you are not doing face to face.
Which is kind of a bit more horrific when you think about it. The idea of like pressing a button and then hundreds of miles away, a bunch of children get their arms blown off and stuff.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, it's horrific in the sense that modern warfare is so dehumanized. It's so yeah, like you said, you can flip a switch and kill hundreds of people 1,000 miles away. And you never actually see the consequences. You're never face to face with the actual consequences of it, or if you are, it's extremely rare. Whereas back then everything was done face to face. All the killing was done face to face. So in that aspect, yes, warfare back then would be considered maybe more shocking or more horrific, or just, we're just not used to that kind of thing in today's day and age. But at the same time, it's something that if you're trying to use that as a criticism, and it also goes back to the point that I made earlier about the properly understanding medieval sources and medieval source materials, in that, again, the way in which they told their stories is not the way that we tell stories today. They were not obsessed with scientific, meticulous accuracy, like we are today. Although, you could even make the argument with things like the mainstream media that, are we really? But they were more focused. They placed a much higher emphasis on telling a compelling story that, as our dear friend John Reddick pointed out, that also carried a moral point to it. And so many of the medieval chroniclers were influenced by biblical stories, especially Old Testament biblical stories. They were very, very heavily influenced by that. And so they wanted their stories to sound like those stories. So when you hear things like the rivers of blood that, went up to the reins of their horses and things like that, what they're trying to do is they're trying to hearken back to like Old Testament biblical stories of the capture of Jericho and things like that, that had a lot more cultural currency with their audiences and cultural appeal with their audiences than a story that actually told the objective factual narrative, which I think many of them wouldn't have found all that interesting or compelling.
All right, so we have a question from Crypto44. Is it true the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitallers were going to be combined into one order? If that were to have happened, would the fate of the Templars or New Order have suffered the same fate? The only thing I would ask to you guys, just to add on to that, would be I'm not sure if there were talks of this during the time of the Crusades before you come to the 1300s on the eve of the trial of the Templars, but we do know that many Templars who escaped the persecution did end up joining the Hospitallers. But with that said, I'll leave the rest to you guys.
I would chime in with saying there were very serious talks of the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers being combined into one order in the aftermath of the loss of Acre in 1291, and kind of the, for lack of a better term, nullification of the mission of the Knights Templar in the Holy Land. I think I can't remember which pope it was, but he actually brought the Grand Masters of both the Hospitallers and the Templars, who at the time was the unfortunate Jacques de Molay, and they actually did have a conference of negotiations of sorts of combining the two orders. What would that look like? Could they do it? And unfortunately, the issue was not resolved at that conference, and it may have been one of the things that sealed the Templars' fate. the King of France, and one wonders what would have happened had the Templars agreed to that, or had both the Templars and the Hospitallers agreed to combine, and that maybe the persecution that occurred would not have happened. But the other important thing to remember is that the Templars were really only persecuted, like seriously persecuted, in France. In all the rest of Christendom, they were treated much more with much greater leniency and much greater respect. And the vast majority of them actually did just join the Hospitaller order once the order was dissolved. And many of their assets, I know for a fact, in both in England, that's exactly what happened. All the Templar assets just automatically were transferred over to the Hospitaller order, and many of the English Templars joined the Hospitaller order, which continued in existence all the way up until the English Reformation in the early 16th century. In Spain, there were multiple military orders that the Templar order just kind of morphed into, because you had the Knights of Santiago, you had a couple of other minor military religious orders that were very popular back then. Obviously, Spain considered, the Iberian Peninsula was considered the frontier of Christendom at that time. So they just kind of morphed into their all the various orders that existed. But in most places, the Templar order just morphed into the Hospitaller order after the dissolution of the Templars. So it was only in France that you had the dramatic showdown that you did, and the persecution and the mass executions and things like that.
Stephen, anything to add?
I think Rand covered it all. We can just move on to the next question.
Okay. Next question is, what type of weapons did the Crusaders use compared to that of the Muslims?
I would say the same type of weapons. There are some differences. At times, the Crusaders were using heavier lances, but the Muslims eventually adopted the heavier lance of the Franks. The crossbow was a Crusader weapon that I believe was also adopted by the Muslims, and the Crusaders adopted some of the Muslim weapons as well. But really, this is kind of one of those points that the Crusaders and Muslims were operating at basically an identical civilizational level. This idea that the West was technologically inferior or something to the Islamic world at this time is just absolutely incorrect. We're talking about the same type of weapons, the same type of equipment at this point.
Yeah, I would say you're absolutely correct about that, Stephen. That for the most part, the weaponry and armor that was deployed on the field by both sides was almost perfectly comparable. Obviously, with cultural differences and stylistic design differences and things like that, were probably different, but technologically they were exactly the same. The other thing to remember is that yes, both sides did have maybe some military traditional or some tactical traditions that were different from each other, in that Western armies were always more emphasized on the heavy shock and armor aspect, whereas Eastern armies were more focused on mobility and ranged attacks. But even that was a lot less pronounced than people make it out to be. However, there you can still see some of the maybe the cultural first encounters with each other in the First Crusade, and even the third, even as late as the Third Crusade. Muslim chronicles make a big deal about Western knights, being covered with arrows like a hedgehog, and yet they were untouched, they were unscathed. So they're even non-Western chroniclers acknowledged that the Western knight had a clear advantage in armor, and in just that mass shock capability, whereas Western sources talk about the frustrating inability of Western knights to be able to close with the harassment tactics of Eastern steppe horse archers, and things like that. So yeah, there were some cultural differences for sure, especially on the tactical level, but in terms of just strict military technology, it was for the most part comparable across the board.
Okay, next question is from Justin Lohr. How feasible is it that the Templars carried the Ark of the Covenant to North America? It sounds like the whole History Channel, Christopher Columbus kind of thing.
I was about to say this sounds like material for Dan Jones's next book.
Do you guys even want to touch this one, or?
Yeah, I mean, we appreciate the question, Justin. Basically, not feasible. The Templars never made it to North America. So
there you go.
Yeah, there's the. I feel like this is one of those makes for a great story kind of things, but no, it's
bad history.
And people wonder. Yeah. People wonder about this stuff because it's out there and it's floating around.
Sure.
So it's
sure.
So
it's interesting. It's compelling, but at the end of the day, it has absolutely no currency whatsoever in historical scholarship, and there's just the very idea from an academic standpoint is just kind of laughable. But
yeah, definitely didn't happen. It's in kind of the category of mythological ideas about the Templars, which there's a lot of mythological ideas about them because they were very famous and they kind of occupy an area of the fantasy world of the collective imagination. So and I guess we have a question now from our good buddy Tom Griffin, a good friend of the channel.
Yeah, I actually do have an answer that I'll touch on. His question is, did the Byzantines ever have religious military orders like the Franks? So what you need to understand about the Byzantine Empire contra the West at the time is that the Byzantines were Greek Orthodox, and the Greek Orthodox Church did not make that same sort of, theological transition where they could say that monks are now permitted to become warriors and fight for the cause of God. As to this day, priests and monks who kill even an animal are to be excommunicated by the church. So I don't think that the idea of the warrior monk that people like Bernard of Clairvaux developed in the West ever really meshed with Greek Byzantine culture.
Well, and kind of in dovetail with that, Peter, another thing that was very prevalent in the Eastern, especially the Byzantine religious culture, was they had a lot less, for lack of a better term, I know this is a very modern term, but it's kind of the only one that works, but they had a lot less separation of church and state than the West did. They still operated off of sort of the old Romantic variation of, the emperor was still seen as the Pontifex Maximus, much like even back in pre-Christian days, the Roman emperors were were seen. They were the, there was sort of a priestly role with the supposed head of state in the Roman tradition that the Byzantines hearkened back to. And you saw that in the Byzantine social and political hierarchy. So yeah, there wasn't, it was just a very different social and religious culture that was present in the Byzantine Empire than you had in the West. And you didn't, there really wasn't room for something like military orders in the Byzantine social structure. It just, that's just not how they were. It's not it. I think the very concept would have been antithetical to them. And you even saw that with one of the things that like the Byzantine chroniclers of Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who was very unusually pro-Latin and had a very deep appreciation of Latin culture in his court. I mean, he even hosted things like jousts, Western style jousts, at his court and things like that. The fact that like the Byzantine chroniclers like scolded him for that or like looked down on that, so I don't, the idea of knighthood and the chivalric tradition and things like that, it wasn't there. It wasn't present in Byzantine society.
Yeah, that they were more of the fans of the cataphract type of cavalry. All right, next question from Lucas Santaguida. Isn't it interesting that Peter Abelard, Heloise, Anna Comnena, and Urraca were teens, and John Comnena and Sigurd the Crusader were kids when the First Crusade happened? I guess this is more of a comment.
That is kind of interesting to think about.
Well, it's I think it's a testament to just how socially, what a massive generational event the Crusades were for all of Western Europe. I mean, it really was. I think, it's funny that a lot of military, especially medieval military historians, talk about the Battle of Hastings as like this, generational event that occurred. I think for them, the Crusades were far more important and far more impactful. I think they would have thought of, comparatively, they would have thought of something like the battle of, the Norman conquest of England and the battle of Hastings as kind of a mere footnote. Oh yeah, that's cool, that's interesting, that's going on over there. Whereas, I mean, the Crusades really was all across Christendom, and that, I think that was a far more impactful generational event to the folks that grew up and were born in that period and who were alive to see that happen. I think it really did come to define multiple generations in Western Europe. That was something that really impacted them all in some way, shape, or form.
Tom Griffin with another question. Were the Hospitallers or Teutonic Knights ever targeted by authorities like the Templars?
The Hospitallers know. The Teutonic Knights, the Teutonic Order, unfortunately, literally all the time. The Teutonic Order were sort of the bad boys of the military orders. They were the ones constantly getting in trouble, running into tight spots with the papacy and the magisterium just because of their kind of unique situation. I can't remember how many times they were officially censured by the papacy because of methods employed during the Baltic Crusades, or during during their operations up there in the Baltics region and Eastern Europe. But yeah, they were definitely the ones kind of constantly in trouble, for lack of a better term, operating on their own initiative up there, and not having the traditional motivations of a Catholic military order, and having maybe more territorial or expansionist tendencies up where they were. So it often, I think even Innocent III like threatened them with like serious censure if they didn't back off of, because the other problem with the Teutonic Order was they kept kind of like picking fights with like other Christian powers, and that became like especially true like in the later periods, where they were like, I mean, they went to full scale war with the extremely Catholic Kingdom of Poland, where it was like, okay, what are you guys doing up there? Like, it's so and they, because of their very deep ties and intimate association with the German Holy Roman Emperors, who were often at odds with the papacy. I think they were kind of seen as the military order that the church couldn't trust, or whose loyalties the church really couldn't be sure of, in that time. So it was. I mean, the Teutonic Order was the only religious order, maybe with the exception of the Order of Santiago in Spain, and the other Spanish, like Iberian religious order or military orders, but they were kind of the only religious order or military order that they weren't universal. They were specifically tied to a particular ethnic region of Europe and kind of a specific ethnic makeup. Same with the Livonian Sword Brothers and things like that. They were very German, and they were very tied to the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperors. And so it was, their relationship with the church was always very problematic, their entire history. And I think it's very telling that once the Reformation occurred, they were the only military order whose Grand Master converted to Lutheranism and essentially separated itself from Catholicism. So, there's that.
Well, did Peter the Hermit make it to Jerusalem during the First Crusade, and what eventually happened to him?
I went ahead and looked it up, actually, while you guys were talking. He did make it to Jerusalem, and he was also present for the Battle of Ascalon. And then apparently, after the Crusade was over, he went to Latakia, which is one of the ports of the Principality of Antioch, and sailed for the west. And at that point, he disappears from the historical record.
Sorry. From Deef. Did Richard the Lionheart bring longbowmen during the Third Crusade? Rand has something to say about that.
Yes, I do, actually. I came back just for that question. That's the problem there is, what are we identifying as longbowmen? Are we talking about longbowmen in the sense of like the 100 Years' War? Probably not, because they that particular military system in England did not really exist at that point. However, were there maybe precursors that accompanied him? I would say yes. I I mean, there's always been a tradition of military archery that was unique to the medieval British Isles, particular regions of Wales, especially South Wales, like Deheubarth and places like that, and Powys. So yeah, it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that there were maybe precursors of the of warriors who would later go on in the 14th and 15th centuries to win fame or infamy, depending on which side you're on, all across Europe during the 100 Years' War. But in the sense of, were there longbowmen in the sense of, like, were, the same kind of guys that were at Agincourt or Crécy or Poitiers? Probably not. That military system did not exist at the time of the Third Crusade. So anyone who did go, who was maybe bearing the predecessor weapon to that, would have been from very specific regions in which that weapon was prevalent. So I'm sure there were some Welsh volunteers who went on who were bearing that weapon, but not in any sense to make them like a self-identified faction of the army. No.
Why did the Franks always help the Castilians and the Bulgarians always attack Byzantium?
Should I get that one?
This kind of reminds me of when we were talking about the Bulgarians before, and I think like how a lot of our Bulgarian followers will confuse Baldwin, the Latin emperor of Constantinople, with another Baldwin, like Baldwin I, and they're always like, can you get to the part where we kick his ass?
Yeah, I have seen comments like that on some videos about First of Jerusalem, but yeah, basically if we're talking about like the Franks as in the French, they were a part of Latin Christendom, and so were the Castilians and the other Spanish and Iberian kingdoms. So very closely associated in terms of their civilization, certainly in terms of their branch of Christianity. The Bulgarians, as far as I know, and I'm not as up on Byzantium and their interactions with the peoples around them, the Bulgarians pretty much viewed the Byzantines like a lot of the other groups that were ruled over by the Byzantines viewed them. They viewed them as kind of an oppressive, conquering force. I mean, the Armenians tended to have the same perspective. And the Byzantines were kind of trying to impose their rule over these different groups. And these were groups that did not have any interest in being ruled over by them. But I think it's probably more complicated than that. But that's just kind of my basic understanding of it. You guys might have further comments.
I can't really comment. It's not really my area of expertise. Ran?
Well, we can move on for there. I mean, I think
Sure.
That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
But I know we're kind of about an hour in here. Do you guys want to keep going a little longer, or should we kind of wrap things up for tonight, or what do you guys think?
I say we push. This is a debut event, so let's give everybody a treat.
Okay, I agree.
Yeah, we can do a few more questions. Tom Griffin again, another good question. Are there any primary sources that detail the first Crusaders' journey home after taking Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, nothing is coming to mind for me at the moment. There are some details in some of the main primary source accounts, but is there some stuff about Robert Curthose and I know there's stuff about like Robert Curthose and Robert of Flanders like going through the Byzantine Empire on their way back and all of that.
I was just about to mention the only one that I've ever seen that is that's detailed or that gives any appreciable level of detail is the Chronicle. unfortunately, I apologize to our listeners. I cannot remember it off the top of my head, but there is a chronicle that does cover the life of Robert Curthose after his participation in the First Crusade, and his journey back to Normandy, which involves him going through the recently conquered Norman principalities of Sicily and southern Italy, or Calabria.
Is that Orderic Alice by any chance?
I think so. That sounds right, but I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, he does. It is detailed. How he he married a Sicilian, a Norman, a Siculo-Norman princess. Became had very close ties with the Italian Normans in the South. He was obviously, I mean, they obviously shared kinship ties, and then and even just cultural ties. But and then he makes his way obviously back to Normandy, where he ends up in conflict with his youngest brother Henry, who becomes Henry I of England. And those two kind of go at it with each other over, who is the ultimate heir of their father's legacy. Their father obviously being William the Conqueror, and Robert, unfortunately, apparently his bad habits that he was known for in the West catch back up with him once he returns to the West, and he ends up getting handily bested by his youngest brother Henry, who ends up imprisoning him in Cardiff Castle in Wales, where he spends the rest of his life and ends up dying in the mid 1100s. I think like the 1130s.
Yeah, he was actually the longest living of
the
First Crusade.
Yeah, he was, and apparently, according to local legend, Robert Curthose, during his imprisonment, which apparently the terms of which became looser and looser, with the older that he, with the more aged he became, apparently developed a very deep felt love for the Welsh language, and actually ended up becoming somewhat of a poet in Welsh, and wrote a couple of poems in Welsh. In medieval Welsh, that fragments of which exist today, but yeah. So I kind of envision Robert Curthose at the end of his life being kind of this reclusive, eccentric, Welsh-loving literary type who, kind of spent the last years of his life just telling stories and writing poems and sheltering himself away from the political nonsense of his day. But he was probably he probably was super popular around fireside storytelling sessions. But ultimately kind of a sad, tragic figure at the same time.
Did any princes ever forgo the throne to join the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, or Teutonic Knights?
Wasn't there an Iberian king? I want to say it was an Aragonese king who, like, for a brief couple of years, actually left his kingdom in the hands of the Templars.
Alfonso the Battler.
That's it. Yeah, thank you.
When he died, that was in his will. But in terms of any who actually joined, the Count of Champagne, Hugh, joined the Templars. He actually renounced his wealth and position. His vassal, Hugh of Payon, was the founder of the Templars, and so then the Count of Champagne renounced his wealth, joined the Templars, and was at that point following his former vassal.
That's true. I completely forgot about Hugh de Champagne.
That's the only one I know of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I can't think of any other. like actual princely or kingly leader who gave up his inheritance to join one of the religious order or one of the military orders. I do know that quite a few kings and noblemen on their deathbeds became sworn members of the Templar Order. One of the most famous of which is William Marshall of England, who on his deathbed became a fully sworn member of the Knight Templar Order before he died, and was buried with honors as a member of the Templar Order, which is why if you go to the Temple in London, that's where you see his grave effigy.
And we should probably also mention that Afonso the Conqueror, King of Portugal, he stated in a document written to the Templars that he considered himself a brother in their fraternity, essentially. So he was kind of like a non-official member from his perspective.
Yep. Or what they would call in the Templar Order, they would call a confrere brother. Confrere brothers were sort of like what you would think of as like a third order lay member, of their order. That was very, very popular back then.
Did Tancred or any of the other leaders from the First Crusade form military orders? I cannot think of any example of this happening.
I
don't think so.
Most of Battler set up his own Templar-esque order. He was one of the first Iberian kings to set up a Spanish-based brother knight group. I don't think his order survived him, though. He installed them in some of his frontier castles and stuff, but he modeled them after the Templars.
Right. Yeah, in terms of the First Crusade in the Holy Land.
I really don't. Yeah, none of the famous lords or barons who participated in the First Crusade and who actually stayed in the Holy Land. None of them formed like military or religious orders. They mostly stayed as the secular aristocracy of the new Frankish principalities.
Are there any accounts of what happened to the Holy Lance after Peter Bartholomew's trial by fire?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, it kind of disappears from the record, unfortunately.
Okay, we have a comment from John Reddick. Conrad of Thuringia gave up his title to enter the Teutonic Knights. I don't know anything about this. Do you?
Yeah, that was the one kind of major blind spot that I have is I really don't know enough about the Teutonic Order to speak with authority on that, but it would not surprise me if there were minor German lords who ended up joining the Teutonic Order. It was a very present institution in medieval German society, and it had very deep connections with the the medieval German society as a whole, especially within the Holy Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. And we have a nice little plug here for our friend J. Stephen Roberts' book, Why Does the Heathen Rage? Highly recommended. Everyone watching right now to check out, and please also support Knights of the Cross /Christian channel. Thanks for the plug, Tom. We really appreciate that.
Thank you, Tom.
A lot of John Reddick starting to appear in these comments.
I just had to put John's comment here, wading in blood up to their knees, brah.
Tom, who are the greatest Templar and Hospitaller Grand Masters that ever lived?
Odo of Saint Amand. for sure. One of them.
Yeah, Hugh of Payon as well, the founder.
Yeah. Odo, and then the one who came after Odo, I believe, Arnold of Taronga, I believe it was. I like him as well.
I've always been partial to who were the. I think it was the Marshal of the Templars and the Grand Master of the Hospitallers who fought side by side at the loss of Acre in 1291. I kind of feel like as tragic as that story is, it really is one of the. It's a very inspiring story. With the the two heads of the the religious or of the military orders fighting side by side to the death with each other during Acre, and it was the Templars who when they retreated into the Citadel, they ended up bringing down the Citadel on themselves, along with the Mamluks as they poured in. It was really a kind of an Alamo story. With them, where they literally did fight to the last man for Acre, and it was if it had to end in defeat, I think that's it was the most inspiring version of a defeat you could ever have. So,
okay. Here from 09 Stoneheart, another common question about the Crusades. The Fourth Crusade has all but been deemed as the quintessence of the Crusader movement by postmodernists. What are your thoughts? Where does it really belong in a discussion of the Crusades?
Well, first and foremost, you have to stop calling it a crusade. And I think it was the scholar who really has tried to push this.
Jonathan Phillips,
maybe, and I think Thomas Asperge has also pushed this a little bit, but is that the Fourth Crusade was not a crusade. By definition, it was not. Anything that happened post Siege of Zara was not a crusade. It was certainly not a sanctioned crusade. Innocent III made it extremely clear that anybody who proceeded on after the Siege of Zara was an excommunicate. Excommunicates cannot lead crusades. There is no the crusading indulgence is removed from them. It does not exist. Therefore, it is not a crusade. Yes, there may have been some who considered it, who continued to call it a crusade, but just because they say it's a crusade does not mean it was actually a crusade. And it became very apparent to everybody involved that the focus had shifted from finding a way to liberate the Holy Land or to help defend the Holy Land to getting involved in extremely labyrinthine political schemes of the Byzantine Empire. That was not a crusade. I think, unfortunately, modern narratives have seized upon that as, oh, look how intolerant they were. Look how xenophobic they were. Which is kind of hilarious, because really, when we're talking about the Latin seizure of the city of Constantinople, we're talking about a bunch of, basic, for lack of a better term, professional mercenaries and sellswords who, at the end of the day, they just wanted to get paid. And they had a set of skills, and they were good at something, and they weren't doing it for free. And they were dealing with a political leadership that had hired them, that was writing checks that they couldn't cash. And so they got frustrated, and they did what a bunch of professional killers do best, and they took matters in their own hands and essentially paid themselves, for lack of a better term. And then there were people who stayed behind and tried to make the best of what had happened. and then that's where you get the Latin Empire, for what it's worth, for what it was worth, which wasn't much. But the idea that the Fourth Crusade is considered a crusade at all is just kind of absurd, because it wasn't one.
Yeah, I think too, it has to be viewed as primarily a Venetian-driven thing. You could almost say the Venetians kind of hijacked it and took control of the direction of it and directed it toward Venetian political ends.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunities for scholarship or for scholarly research. With people don't realize that the vast majority of the army of the Fourth Crusade that set out from Venice and landed at Zara actually departed the army after Innocent's bull of excommunication was delivered at Zara, and they made their own way to the Holy Land. I think there's a massive amount of untapped scholarly research waiting to happen of what happened to all of them. What happened to all these guys who made their own way to the Holy Land? Like, what impact did they have on the Levant? I feel like the emphasis is kind of misplaced on focusing all this attention on the professional mercenaries and sellswords who made their way to Constantinople and got embroiled in that just ridiculous internal affair over there. And we're kind of missing out on the story of all the genuine crusaders who actually, after the threat of excommunication, after they were presented with the threat of excommunication, said, "Hey, whoa, we're done with this. We're making our own way. We're going to actually go do what we said we were going to do, and we're going to go to the Holy Land." And they did. So I'd be fascinated to see somebody who could actually research that and see maybe what impact did they have. Was there, were they maybe responsible for, prolonging the existence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem post Third Crusade, well into that next century? What kind of impact did they have there? And I wish somebody would shift the focus of the research towards something like that, and we leave just the whole kind of capture of Constantinople and things like that. I wish we could just kind of leave that as the grubby little chapter of history that it is, and stop at the end of the day, stop calling it a crusade, please, because it wasn't at all.
Okay, so Peter, did you have to go now, or did you want to stick around for a little bit longer? Okay. Maybe Peter already went to get his dinner.
Oh, no. Sorry, I realized I was unmuted.
Oh, no,
I do have to go, but hey, it's a great debut live stream for this new channel, and I'm looking forward to many more. So thank you guys. Thanks to all of you guys who tuned in and asked some really interesting questions, and we'll see you soon.
Take care, Peter.
All right, Peter. See you later.
See ya.
Did you want to go a little bit longer, Rand?
I can maybe go for a few minutes more. There was one question in particular that grabbed my attention. It was from our user D2, who said, "Did the Spanish military orders ever participate in battles in the New World?" And the only reason I wanted to touch on that was because there's actually a really super interesting historical anecdote that a lot of people don't know about the Age of Discovery. And that is that at one time, the Order of the Hospitallers actually owned the French portion of the Caribbean for about, like, it was like not even 10 years. But they actually, the French, when the Age of Discovery was in full swing and everybody was kind of laying claim to whatever islands they could, the initial French islands in the Bahamas that they had seized, they actually sold. I want to say it was in the mid 1600s. They actually sold those islands very briefly to the Order of the Knights Hospitaller, and who at the time their Grand Master was a Frenchman, who had ties to the ruling aristocracy of France. So for a very brief time, there were New World, that the Order of the Knights Hospitaller actually had possessions in the New World, particularly in the French Bahamas. If you can even look it up, there were even when they were there, they actually, I think there's, I want to say it's on the island of Saint Lucia, but I'm not sure about that. I'll have to look this up. I'm just going off purely memory right now. And I've had about 4 drinks already, so my memory is not what it should be. But yeah, they were. There's a church built somewhere on the Caribbean that actually, one of the churches actually still bears the seal or the coat of arms of the Hospitaller Order on it. So it's this last little vestigial remnant. And again, like I said, they only own these islands. They didn't even own these islands for a full decade. They owned them very, very briefly before they sold them back to, I want to say they sold them to the Spanish, I think. So yeah, if anybody's interested in looking up that weird little chapter of history, there was a brief couple of years where the Order of the Knights Hospitaller actually owned a part of the Caribbean. And it's something that a lot of people don't realize about that period of history.
All right, so Josh Diaz here brings up Frederick II and his crusade. He says, wasn't Frederick II excommunicated? Wasn't the Sixth Crusade technically won? And that's a good point. And yeah, the truth is, Josh, if we go by the technical definition, it was not a crusade because, he was excommunicated and the crusade was not sanctioned by the church, therefore. So yeah, we can slash the Sixth Crusade as being a genuinely valid crusade. And indeed, I know there are some historians who label the Seventh Crusade as the Sixth Crusade because of that exact issue.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. I have also seen that where the
St. Louis is called the Sixth Crusade.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Especially by French historians, which is I find personally humorous. But yeah, it's well, and something that isn't talked about a whole lot unless you're our very dear friend Dr. Helena Schrader, who's basically this forms the basis of her entire historical fiction novel series that covers the Ibelin family after, during this period. But something that doesn't get talked about very often is Frederick II made a lot of enemies in the Holy Land. When he showed up, they did not like him at all. The Templars didn't like him. The Hospitallers didn't like him. The native Poulain Frankish nobility despised him. He was very much seen as kind of this very disruptive element that came in and really irritated a lot of people when he just sort of swept in and proclaimed himself king of Jerusalem. It actually caused quite a bit of internal conflict within Latin Outremer at the time that had a very destabilizing effect on the Frankish hold of Outremer at the time. In fact, I kind of feel like if there's really someone to blame for enabling the final collapse of the Frankish Levant, it's Frederick II. He really did come in like a bull in a china shop in there and just really disrupted a lot of the stability that had been slowly growing ever since the smashing successes of the Third Crusade. They kind of never really recovered after that.
Yeah, and I don't think that Frederick's quote-unquote crusade was anything but a fiasco. I mean, this idea that he recovered Jerusalem, I think, is kind of fraudulent. He didn't recover Jerusalem in any meaningful way. The city was still very vulnerable and essentially was not defensible, as the military orders and the clergy and the local knights and nobility said it would not be. And so, yeah, I think I used to be more sympathetic to Frederick's crusade, but now my opinion has really changed, in part because of Helena's arguments. I think it was a fiasco, and I think he's not an admirable figure. I don't admire his career both as Holy Roman Emperor or as a crusader. So I'll just leave it at that. I think that the Third Crusade, although it did not recover Jerusalem, was a far more successful expedition, far more important expedition. In fact, Frederick's was the opposite. It was a destructive expedition that created divisions, and the quote-unquote recovery of Jerusalem was basically fraud.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I would to maybe throw a bone out to contemporary popular culture. I kind of feel like Frederick II did to the Frankish presence in the Holy Land what Disney has done to the Star Wars franchise. Like they kind of took something, that was really, really good and had really done well before them, and they just kind of ruined it for their own purposes. They kind of took it and twisted it and bent it and out of self-serving purposes, just kind of ruined it. And it never really recovered after that. If I'm allowed to make pop culture analogies here.
You are, Ren. So, okay, I guess we'll kind of end things with this very nice comment from John Reddick, who always has intelligent things to say. I think the most interesting thing about Frederick's quote-unquote crusade is that Hermann von Salza managed to retain the favor of the Pope and the Emperor. And yes, Hermann von Salza was perhaps the most skilled politician in history in how he managed both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Pretty brilliant. So we'll I guess Rand, we've been going for over an hour and a half now, so I guess we can probably call it a night. Are you ready to do that, my friend?
I am. The only thing I'll let our viewers know is, this channel has a lot of, we have a lot of content planned for this. We're going to be airing, of course, everything is going to be live. Everything is going to be uncut and uncensored. It's going to be raw content, as it were. But we're going to host live guest interviews on this channel. We actually have our first live guest interview set up. Unfortunately, I don't have a date for everybody, but it will be this month. And it's going to feature none other than our very dear friend, Dr. Andrew Latham. He'll be our very first guest live guest interview on here. So once again, of course, you can ask questions in the comments, and we'll try to get to them all. But really, this is your chance to interact with us live, and with our esteemed guests. As we continue on, we'll also do things like we'll do live book interviews, of recent Crusade scholarship, and also maybe some classic Crusade scholarship. We'll go over some of the books that we have, like on our recommended reading list on our website, with everybody. So, and we're also opening it up to various specialty shows. I know our dear friend Peter, unfortunately, he had to leave early tonight, but I know he wants to do a series on the Armenian contribution to the Crusades, which I think would be fascinating, especially for anybody who's interested in that particular niche, area of history. And then, who knows? We'll open it up to other shows, but or other forms of content. But really, this is our opportunity. This channel, the inspiration behind this channel is to offer you all, live content, live access to us as we discuss these topics, and we can go on from there. So definitely, tell your friends about it. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, and keep us in your pocket, because we want to continue to bring you this type of content as often as possible. So,
all right, awesome. Well, Rand, thanks for doing this with me. It's been a lot of fun. We'll call it a night now. Good night, everybody. We will see you soon.
Absolutely.